And we're live. It is Sunday, May 24th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Boris Johnson, it was a bad day. He refused to sack his chief advisor as a growing scandal threatens to wreck Britain's lockdown, reports CNN. What is the scandal? The scandal is that Dominic Cummings, the chief aide to the prime minister, repeatedly broke lockdown restrictions multiple times. The prime minister said that Cummings had, quote, no alternative but to drive 260 miles across England to stay with his parents while his wife was sick with COVID-19 symptoms, insisting he, quote, acted responsibly, legally, and with integrity. Maybe. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-un has been cited in public. He presided over a meeting in the first time in over 3 weeks, hosting military officers, according to state media reports. The current wisdom is that his long period of absences of late has not been the result of anything health related, but merely about concerns about coronavirus. And finally, I don't know if Kate's back yet.
I'm back.
But finally, this is important. Important for Kate, it's important murder hornet news. CNN is reporting that murder hornets are not the bugs you should be worried about. Guess which ones they say in this contrarian piece are the ones you should be concerned about.
Are they going to say mosquitoes?
Duh. Yeah.
I hate this. I hate this.
That. It's like the murder hornet backlash time, right? Like, duh, when we discover that actually mosquitoes suck.
Okay. Or it's like the people who are like, what's the big deal with COVID-19? Like, right. People die in
Malaria
car accidents
sucks.
all the time. Like,
exactly.
And I'm like, right. yeah.
Right. Good one, CNN. Right. We know mosquitoes kill a lot of people. Guess what? Hippopotamuses also. Don't mess with them. They're like way more dangerous than lions.
Man bites motherfuckers.
Yeah, and they're really protective of their young. And if you get in the water, they eat you or they chomp on you. Anyway, we're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, it is Criminal Justice Week on in lieu of fun. And to kick off in lieu of fun, Criminal Justice Week, we have a mystery guest, Carissa Byrne Hessick, who I have never met before, but who knows a veritable shitload, that is a technical term, about prosecutors and the way they behave. She is a professor at the University of North Carolina Law School. She is one of my favorite law professor Twitter follows, not because she's especially funny, which is a good reason to follow some law professors, but because she actually knows a lot about criminal law, and she does these Twitter threads that are informative and useful on the news. So Carissa, welcome to In Lieu of Fun, and thank you for joining us to kick off Criminal Justice Week.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited. This is, I can easily say, the most exciting thing I'm doing today or this week.
Yeah, that is, I want to say, like damning with faint praise, but okay. we will take it in the spirit.
I'll take it.
Meant. So I want to start with a very broad question, which is a lot of people, including me, have been howling with rage the last several months at the so-called politicization of the Justice Department. And there is a response to that that is not wholly without merit. That is, come on, the Justice Department is inherently political. The task of prosecution is inherently political. And you know, the choice of whom to prosecute, given the plethora of options under the law at any given time, is a political choice. So stop whining. And I am interested in your thoughts on the question of in what sense prosecution is a political function and in what sense it stands outside of politics.
Yeah, so that's a huge and difficult question, and I think it depends on.
Yeah, starting with the easy ones here.
Okay. I'm not going to try to answer it all at once. I mean, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think we need to think about state prosecutors and federal prosecutors as separate categories, because state prosecutors, they're often directly elected. So, I live in North Carolina. It elects a prosecutor for each judicial district. So there are, however many, a few dozen in the state. A lot of states, they elect a prosecutor for every single county. So direct elections of prosecutors are really common. So it's, I think, difficult to say that state, local right, and state AGs are often direct, but they're not always directly elected. Difficult to say that they're not political or not supposed to be political, because the check on them is primarily a political check, right? The Justice Department is different. Obviously, the federal system. The Attorney General is not elected. Individual U.S. attorneys, sort of the chief prosecutors in districts across the country, also not elected. The president is elected, and he appoints the Attorney General, and he appoints the U.S. attorneys. But that appointment process is a pretty political process, right? I mean, if you look at the background of a lot of people who get chosen as U.S. attorneys, they often have political connections to their home state senators, for example, that got them that job. I think if you look at the Attorney General that President Trump initially appointed, right, he was a senator and an early political supporter of the president. So if you're just talking about how prosecutors are selected, I'd say it's a very political process to select them. And then I think there's a separate question about how politics play into general policies, and then how politics play into individual prosecutions. And I think that's really the meat of what people are concerned about right now.
So
No, go ahead, Kate.
So I kind of want to dig in. I don't know if this is something that you spend a lot of time pulled up your CV, and now like I'm looking at all of the cool things that you've written, and I'm very I'm super interested in talking to you about child pornography, actually, because I think that this is something that I do a lot with because of content moderation. No, Ben, gross.
No. I mean, because of my work on sextortion.
Oh, right. Yes.
I've ended up deeper in the world of child porn prosecutions and cases than I ever wanted to be. No, I meant that without even a trace of humor.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize that you'd kind of focused on that with sextortion, but so no, I didn't mean to like call you out for it. I was just like, but anyway, awkward. Moving on. I would love to talk to you about that, so I want to shift there. Before I do, Ben's question and your response kind of brings up this really fascinating part of federalism and like democracy and legitimacy that I think is we gloss over and just like take it as a given of like the election versus the appointment of different people in different systems. And everyone who watches the show knows that my mom was a state Supreme Court judge. She was elected in 14-year terms, like huge long terms. I'm from New York, so that was so that's like the highest trial court. And then my dad is a town judge, also elected. So that was my familiarity with the law growing up, and discovering kind of the exceptionalism with which law schools treat like the federal system. Obviously, it was like completely different and eye-opening to me, but it still, what really boggles my mind are debates like those raised by like Sandra Day O'Connor in her retirement about like getting rid of elected judges and having all appointed judges. This seems like the worst of possible worlds. People are so hard on elected judges, and I do not understand how that is a better system than or a worse system necessarily than an appointment system. It really varies by state and like some of the election rules. But I'm just kind of curious what you think about that. Like you said, the nomination and the appointment process was political, but it's so indirectly political. And it also is so elite. Like all like it's like, you know, where you went to law school, and it's like who you know, and that you know your senator, or you have like someone that recommends you. Whereas there is like, Joe Schmo, like with a shingle out, can run for like town justice or state justice.
Yeah. So look, you're asking a great question. So I want to talk about two different things, like what it would mean for an election to be a good selection mechanism. I think, I'm sort of ambivalent about electing prosecutors, and I know less about electing judges, but I'm ambivalent about it for similar reasons, which is I think that there's something to the idea of, letting people have a say in what their government looks like and who's in charge of making important decisions. But if you look at the elections that are held for those offices, especially, and I'll talk here specifically about prosecutors, I really worry that voters don't get the information that they need to make informed decisions, right? So if a prosecutor's most important decisions are hidden from view, which they largely are, right? Who do they decide not to prosecute? How favorable are the plea deals that they're giving, right? This is incredibly difficult information for me to discover with like librarians and research assistants helping me. Like my mom isn't going to be able to discover it for the person who's running for prosecutor in her county. So we have this sort of this ballot box check, but voters don't have enough information, I think, really to be able to exercise it. Instead, what they see are high profile cases, which, as you can probably imagine, get treated differently than non-high profile cases. So to the extent that they do have information, it's actually probably not representative of what happens. And I think that idea that a newspaper or a TV station might pick up on a case drives prosecutorial decision making maybe more than it should, right? Yeah. And so that's going to lead to cases being treated differently or certain decisions being made because they're less visible.
No, so, I like that. I like that a lot. That's a super smart. I mean, like obviously, but it's just
obviously.
But I didn't. Yeah, I think that's so. Like, I think that's a great point. But I mean, also that kind of goes for all elections, doesn't it? Isn't it like all elections are like voters are idiots? I mean, it's kind of a very like,
well, but there are, when you take a legislator, which is the most obvious candidate for election, right? Their votes are public, and their formal acts in committees are public, right? And so you have there is no equivalent for the legislator of the case they did not bring. They have a record, and it's a record in the context of the aggregate work product of the institution that they're associated with. Whereas a prosecutor, there's no analogy to prosecutorial discretion on the part of a legislator. And I do think, the question of how you're expected to appreciate whether the prosecutor has done a good job in the exercise of discretion is a really complicated and nuanced one, which returns me to my original question. So you've given, Carissa, a really good account, both at the state and federal level, of the senses in which the prosecutorial function is political. That is, the appointments mechanism, the removal mechanism, how these people are chosen, and the political valences to their selection. But I want to ask the other question, the opposite question. When we say Bill Barr is politicizing the Justice Department, he is, and there's a negative association with that. What is the sense, and are we just being naive, that the prosecutorial function is not political, despite we have this myth, despite all the factors that you've just identified, that an assistant U.S. attorney is supposed to look at the facts and look at the law and follow certain, high-minded political guidance about priorities, but is not supposed to say, well, Carissa, you know, she may be really guilty of this, but she's also a political supporter of the president. And so we're going to leave her alone. And Kate Klonick, you know, we think she's got a plausible defense here, but we're going to make her answer for it because she's associated with that Wittes guy, right? And, you know, we want to put pressure on people who are, you know, doing content moderations research because, you know, they're all part of the deep state. You know, why in the face of everything you just said, why do we have this mythology that the federal prosecutor or the state prosecutor is supposed to be an apolitical figure or a non-political figure? And is it just mythological, or is there something really to it?
So I think that people would tell you that there is something to it, and I'm less certain. But let me give you a historical example. So I think it was like the first or the second year that I was a law professor. I was teaching at a school in Arizona, and the law school had an event where all of the U.S. attorneys who'd been fired by the George W. Bush administration for political reasons.
We're in 2007 here, right?
Yes, this is a while ago. This is a long time ago. They would go around and they would give speeches about what happened and how politicizing the Justice Department is bad and so on and so forth. And, you know, like a lot of law faculty at law school events, I always raise my hand to ask a question because we're like annoying like that. We get excited that it's our turn to raise our hand and ask questions. So that's what I did, right? I was like brand new on the faculty and I raised my hand and I said, you know, I have a question for you. You know, you're saying that it was inappropriate for Main Justice to let you go, that this was political. At the same time, right, U.S. attorneys are answerable to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is supposed to be making decisions. How do we draw the line between inappropriate politics and there's a chain of a command and they decided to kick you out and put someone else in? And their answer was unanimous, that the line between appropriate supervision and centralization of the prosecutorial function in the Department of Justice and inappropriate politics is the level of involvement. They insisted that Main Justice was supposed to set policy, but they were not supposed to get involved at all in individual cases. That was the line. This department, that Department of Justice has overstepped it. It became clear that some of them had been forced out because they didn't take particular positions in particular cases. So like the US attorney in New Mexico wasn't charging some
enough death penalty cases.
That was the guy in Arizona. He wasn't charging enough death penalty cases. No, that's right. That's right. That's right. But so that was their point, right? It was the U.S. Attorney's Office got the guidance from DOJ, but it was his call whether to seek the death penalty in that case. The U.S. Attorney in New Mexico knew what the public corruption guidelines were. He decided not to charge those Democratic state officials, and it wasn't up to Main Justice to second guess that decision. And it was inappropriate for them to be fired when Justice didn't agree with their decisions. Now, I'm still not talking about this Justice Department for a really big reason.
But since this is the case that everybody talks about as politicization of the Justice Department before the Trump administration, it's a good place to start. It's where Kate cut her teeth as a journalist, actually.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, that was one of like the first stories that I worked on and followed up on was the IG report that came out in the wake of that scandal when I was working at Talking Points Memo, which is actually was the place that broke it. Like that was one of their big claims to fame was because they're this small, scrappy blog and they broke this kind of the Attorney General firing scandal because someone leaked it to them, I think, a reader.
Oh, so, wow.
Yeah, it was kind of fun.
This was right. There was this consensus, at least among the U.S. attorneys who'd been fired, that was the dividing line, that the Justice Department had stepped over it, and that's what made it inappropriate politics. And I have to say, at the time, I was like, okay, well, they must be right. They know. And as the years have gone by, and I've spent more time studying discretion in the criminal justice system, both for judges and for prosecutors, I've come to see that answer as kind of a little bit of bullshit, because whatever the Justice Department policies are going to be, they're going to have to be written at a level of generality that requires people to make judgments And sometimes those judgments are going to be really bad judgments. And that's, if you're going to have a main part of the Justice Department that supervises, they have to be able to say, you're exercising your judgment in a crappy way, and we want someone else in there who we think will make different judgment calls, because and we probably don't want main justice crafting policies that are so granular that it would be clear how they get applied in every case.
But so that's a fascinating argument, and I sort of agree with it, with the caveat that I'm uncomfortable with the implications of it, which are that ultimately, if Bill Barr wants to, throw the case against Mike Flynn because Mike Flynn's a friend of the president, it follows from that idea being bullshit that there's kind of nothing wrong with Bill Barr throwing the case. And so I guess I'm interested in sort of what the limiting principle is, or whether there is none. And what we're really talking about here is best practices. Whereas like the best practices is you kind of let the US attorneys within a wide measure of guidance as to policy be the US attorneys. You let the AUSAs do their job as professionals, and you intervene only in situations in which there's some overriding national interest in intervening. But none of that is a point of principle. It's all just kind of a point of kind of normative best practice, because if you don't behave that way, you end up in a ridiculous place like the Mike Flynn case pretty quickly. And so I guess my question is do you have a different line that you would draw from those US attorneys, or do you acknowledge that once you call bullshit on the civic mythology that they were articulating, you're on a slippery slope and it slides down to Mike Flynn really fast?
I don't know. I mean, you're so like, not to turn this into like a therapy session for myself.
No, please do.
But this is basically a giant therapy session. That's what no one understands, is like they're literally our free therapists.
I mean, so
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, as I get older, like the more concerned I become about bright lines and about drawing bright lines. I think that bright lines are deeply, deeply comforting, and I think that there's a reason that we gravitate towards them. I think that there's a reason why, textualism and originalism and those sorts of things that give you a right answer are so appealing. I've come to the tentative conclusion that, our legal system grew up out of the common law for a reason, because sometimes the best thing that you can do is look at an individual case and say yes, and look at a different case and say no, and then look at a dozen more cases to try to extrapolate a principle. And even then, knowing that the principle might not be fully descriptive and it might not give you the right answer in cases going forwards. So I don't think that I personally know of enough examples of sort of politicization within the Justice Department to be able to extrapolate a general principle. But I will say, I feel as though there's one principle that really distinguishes what's happening right now in the Trump presidency from what happened with the US attorney firings and with an awful lot of what's come before. And that's that this isn't just a question about what should happen in a particular case. It's a question about what should happen in a case that is directly related to the president of the United States. And I think that that principle, or that fact, really, in my mind, makes the discussion about where we draw the line between sort of politics and sort of taking a case just on its facts and trying to treat it the same as everyone else. Once we're talking about the fact that this is a president whose own allies have been indicted, whose own allies have been prosecuted, where there was, a special counsel brought in to do these things precisely because we thought that the ordinary political process would result in the wrong outcome. I don't think that what we have right now are in some ways hard cases, because that sort of level of self-interest on the part of the only elected official in that chain of command make it, I think, kind of easy.
Okay, can I add a second distinction between the US attorney firings in 2007, that scandal, and this? That I agree with you that the personal self-interest of the president is a big one, but I actually think there's a second that's really important, which is truth. So when you fire the Arizona US attorney because he didn't bring enough death penalty cases, it is actually true that he didn't bring as many death penalty cases as Alberto Gonzalez would have wanted, right? And when you fire the New Mexico US attorney because he's a little bit of a squish compared to the, right? Like, let's be honest, he's like less conservative than some of the other US attorneys. That isn't false. Now, you may, as a liberal, say, well, wait a minute, what's wrong with that? And I would say, as somebody who's politically kind of sympathetic to being left of the Bush administration, well, nothing, but it is the Bush administration, right? And they're entitled to be conservatives. They got elected. And so there were no lies in the fundamentals of the US attorney firing scandals. They fired a bunch of, US attorneys for political reasons because they weren't as, hard-ass, hardline prosecutors as they would have wanted, and they wanted to replace
Ben,
them.
can I interrupt you for a second and ask Kate to weigh in? Because I think part of the scandal with U.S. attorney firings was they did lie about why they were firing them. And that's why it seemed like a scandal as opposed to like people just complaining that that was an inappropriate reason to fire them. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't, there were a number of lies, and there was a very extensive cover-up. Like they very much hid like the fact that they had an entire coding system of looking at like, it wasn't just firing, by the way. Like it was like they went through and reviewed all existing employees and then like coded them as to whether they were kind of conservative or liberal. But then they had also a coding system for like the honors program and all of these different types of systems of hiring and interns of like that, like, it was like, the honors program was and still is probably one of the most kind of like blue ribbon things that you can do coming out of law school. And that was like getting like, they were filling those with like people who went to like, I don't even know if it's a college of law, but like Liberty College of Law that like,
Monica Goodling. Remember her?
Yes, of course I remember Monica Goodling. I have like a picture of her on my desktop somewhere. It's just like
I knew her pretty well, actually.
Did you? Yeah, Monica Goodling was like specifically like went to like, I don't know, like she was in charge of doing all of that, and that's what the IG report showed. Like it exposed all of that.
So just to be clear, when I say that there were no lies, I don't mean that I don't mean it literally. Because there were lies. What I mean is that if you say that that the actual reason they were firing people was true, right? They may have misrepresented some aspects of it, but that is different from the case with Michael Flynn, which is that the basic reason that they're dismissing this case is a lie. The basic reason they're dismissing this case is not that Michael Flynn was railroaded by a rogue FBI. There was no rogue FBI. It's not that, Brandon von Grack, the evil Bob Mueller prosecutor, set up Michael Flynn and forced him to do it, or, right? There is a fundamental lie at the center of this, which is that there was something wrong and corrupt about the original investigation and decision to prosecute Mike Flynn. And so that seems to me like, in addition to what you're describing, Carissa, which is the fact that the president is personally invested in this case, it is not just that, it is also that they're fundamentally lying both about Michael Flynn's conduct and about the Justice Department's conduct in order to justify dismissing the case. And that seems to me very different from the US attorney's firing scandal, where, yeah, they hid the ball a little bit, but basically they wanted to get rid of a bunch of US attorneys for reasons that were substantive.
No, they weren't. They were political.
Well, but substantively political. They were,
but they were not like, but I would say getting rid of someone for substantive reasons is like for cause. Like you get rid of them because they can't do their job. They literally got rid of them just because they didn't agree with their politics or suspected that.
But okay, but I don't want to fight with you over the meaning of the word substantive.
Okay.
They fired a bunch of US attorneys because they weren't as conservative as they wanted them to be. As they wanted Bush administration US attorneys to be. And that actually, along the lines that Carissa was saying earlier, not really sure. It's very hard to articulate what's wrong with that, except that it makes us feel uncomfortable. But when you have to, in a deep-seated, profound way, lie about the facts of a specific case and a specific investigation and the conduct of a specific defendant in order to justify an action, that is a different level of problem, in my view.
So can
Your
I
thoughts,
ask a
Carissa?
question? I actually want to ask you a question because this is something that I have to say I don't know enough about how the FBI operates or about the
For my sins, I know a lot about the way the FBI operates.
I mean, I guess I see people making arguments. So what's his name? Andrew McCarthy, who writes for the National Review. I mean, he's a very smart person. You know, he's been saying since long before Bill Barr became Attorney General that that Bob Mueller's investigation was inappropriate and he was given more authority than Rosenstein was permitted to get him. And then, you know, Bill Barr writes this memo, which I guess got him the job as Attorney General, again, saying that the Mueller investigation was illegitimate and, you know, the way that it was created and whatever happened, you know, sort of violated DOJ policy, and therefore the investigation shouldn't have gone forward. Now, I don't know enough about what they're saying to be able to say that they're making factually incorrect statements, but the statements that they seem to be making are conclusions that are more than just factual statements. I don't know. This is genuinely a question for you, Ben. Like, I'm hoping you can explain it to me, because every time I try to get into the weeds, people just like start screaming like hoax, Obamagate, and I'm just like, I don't know.
Right. So I think I can. So let's answer this question at two levels. The first is the entire question is irrelevant to this conversation about Michael Flynn, because the Michael Flynn interview took place 4 months before Bob Mueller was even appointed. So assuming that there is some deficiency in the Mueller appointment, that has nothing to do with whether the investigation was predicated or whether Flynn's lies were material at the time that he was interviewed by the FBI in January of 2017.
Very good point.
Yes, very good point. The first point is that the question is actually irrelevant to this issue. The second point is, I will say that I am old enough to remember 3 independent counsel, special counsel investigations of this magnitude: Iran-Contra, the Bill Clinton investigation, the Lewinsky Whitewater investigation, and this. And the common thread through all of them is the very deep-seated belief on the part of defenders of the president that there is something illegitimate or improper about the fact of the investigation itself. And in all 3 cases, the premise is wrong. Like, there is a lot to criticize about Lawrence Walsh, there is a lot to criticize about Ken Starr, and I actually think there's very little to criticize about Bob Mueller at least in terms of over aggressiveness. But in none of the cases is it plausible to say that the investigation was kind of born in original sin of the investigation itself being illegitimate or having kind of wildly exceeded its lawful bounds. In the Walsh case, there was a very good argument, and I think it may be almost a good enough argument to justify what Bill Barr did in 1992, which was to urge the pardons that Bush engaged in. Whether it was good enough to argue for that or not is a really interesting question. But that investigation went on for 7 years. And, you know, the argument that conservatives had that whatever the merits of it at the outset, the length and duration and aggressiveness of it, you know, justified to some degree the pushback that it eventually precipitated. That is, you know, I think it is not a trivial argument. And I have an open mind about it, but I actually think there's a really interesting conversation to be had about that. Ditto Ken Starr, right? Ken Starr did some things that are, I think, you know, hard to justify. I actually wrote a whole book about the Ken Starr investigation. I think his concept of the subject that he was investigating was incredibly grandiose and frankly inappropriate. The idea that he didn't have the lawful authority to do what he did is ridiculous. And ditto Bob Mueller. And I have spent as much time with the underlying material on this as anybody has. There is just no question that in my mind, that he had the authority to look at the things that he looked at. And there's actually no question in my mind that he had the authority to look at things that he didn't look at. And he was incredibly cautious and stayed away from issues that I think under the terms of the mandate Rod Rosenstein gave him, he could have spent time on. And so with all due respect to Andrew McCarthy and to Bill Barr, I think they're wrong. And I think they're frankly wrong on the text of the Rosenstein referral, with one caveat, which is that the Bill Barr memo was about the application of the obstruction statutes to the president. That is an ideological point, not, his argument is that you cannot lawfully apply the obstruction statutes to the president for, Article 2 authorized actions. To the extent you take that ideological position, you can wipe a lot of the Mueller investigation off the boards, which is what Barr ended up doing. So I with that caveat, I think it's, I basically think they're wrong, and it bleeds into conspiracy theories that McCarthy in particular has been unfortunately promulgating a lot.
Can we switch gears a little bit, because we're already at like 5:38, and I really do want to talk about the child pornography stuff.
Yes, absolutely. And if people have questions, this is a good time to flag us in the Q&A.
So Carissa, talk to us a little bit about what your take or what your angle is, like kind of like what your work is on this stuff. I feel like, I'm just really interested to know like what it is that how you picked it up as like a thing to write about, all of it.
Yeah, definitely. So it gets at, oddly enough, it gets at prosecutorial discretion, and it gets at plea bargaining, which is how I sort of came at it. So as I said, I started my teaching career out in Arizona, and Arizona has the harshest child pornography law in the country. It's a mandatory, I forget if it's a 5 or I think it's a 10-year sentence per image. So if you have an image of child pornography on your computer, it's a mandatory sentence, mandatory minimum of 10 years in prison. And all sentences have to run consecutively, right? So they have to run one right after each other. Yeah.
And what is the scienter requirement if somebody puts? I mean, if you have child pornography on your computer, but you in good faith think the image is of somebody who's who's age of majority, what level of of awareness do you have to have that it is child pornography before that law is implicated?
Yeah, no, it's knowing possession. I mean, it's, you know,
Okay.
interestingly enough, the way the statute is written, it covers production, distribution, and possession. They're all sort of lumped together. Arizona's not the only state that does that. It's the only state that has the 10-year mandatory minimum that runs consecutively. And so when I was there, the issue went up before the state Supreme Court whether this sentencing scheme violated the Eighth Amendment, because, you know, some guy, you know, got charged with having 20 images. I'm sure he had more than 20 images. I mean, people rarely have one image or two images, right? They have more images. And so he got sentenced to 200 years in prison. And the argument was, if you look at the punishments that are being handed out for people who've engaged in really horrific hands-on sex abuse of children, you will see that they get less time in prison. And they get less time in prison because the prosecutors have a hard time winning those cases. They don't want to make the child victims testify. And so they'll give plea deals. And so they'll give plea deals of 5 years, 2 years, 14 months. And so the brief before the state Supreme Court collected all of these cases brought by the same prosecutor. You know, there was a guy who, you know, kidnapped and raped a little girl who was going door to door selling candy. And the prosecutor agreed to a sentence of 14 months for that guy. And so they're saying, like, look, you know, it's comparative, blah, blah, blah. And they lost, right? Because the Eighth Amendment doesn't really apply to non-capital sentences.
This is so much like my sextortion research. I mean, we got to talk offline.
Definitely. So like, it's crazy. And we find out years afterwards, by the way, that while the Maricopa County attorney was bringing these cases and putting people in jail for 200 years for possessing child pornography, their office and the sheriff's office, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, weren't investigating complaints of kids being molested. They were just putting them in a drawer, and that's all they were doing. They're just putting them in a drawer. They weren't even investigating.
For what purpose? Like, I feel like that's so like antithetical to my understanding of like people love prosecuting like child molesters and child pornographers or people who have it, because it's like they're just so vilified in like society.
Yeah, which is why when they bring these charges against the people who possess child pornography, they call them predators and they say they're protecting children, and they use all of this language. But those cases, as you can imagine, are incredibly easy to win, right? People will plead guilty so that they'll only have to go to jail for 10 images instead of 20, right? You look in the federal system, you actually see something that's like kind of similar, right? So the federal government doesn't really do child sex abuse cases. They do child pornography cases. And they have this fun little statutory scheme where if you've possessed child pornography, there's no mandatory minimum. But if you received child pornography, there's a 5-year mandatory. So what do? They just use the mandatory minimum to get everybody to plead guilty to possession, right? That's what they do. But you think to yourself, well, it's the federal government. They have a lot of resources. It's important for them to do this. What's the federal government also responsible for? Indian reservations, Indian country. Where do you think we have some of the highest incidents of child sex abuse? And they just don't really prosecute those cases. So my point is to look at sort of the incentives that this creates for law enforcement to go after people who possess child pornography, to not go after the contact cases where they can't or they don't have evidence of the pornography. There's some social science evidence that suggests that the overlap between those groups is not what you would think. Lots of people doing hands-on contact and not downloading images. Lots of people downloading images and not engaging in hands-on contact. But we've conflated the two. So that's the case. But the paper is not people should possess child pornography. Like, that's not what I'm coming from. It's what have we done where we've created a world where law enforcement wants to go after people that are, by all objective measures, causing far less harm than the people who are causing an awful lot of harm.
So this is a really interesting point to me, because I looked at 80 plus sextortion cases, and what you're saying resonates really deeply, because huge disparities in sentences, and they range from, you know, many dozens of years, you know, 70, 40, 100 years, right, to 13 months, 11 months, right? And the two gigantic variables that determine, they're not how bad the conduct is. They are are you prosecuted by the feds or are you prosecuted in state court? You prosecuted in state court, you're gonna get a slap on the wrist. And if you're prosecuted, we didn't have Arizona cases, so that would have been an interesting, but you know, we looked at people who were guys sextorting 15 young boys in Rhode Island. He was a wrestling coach, and he basically used the wrestling network to go after kids. He got 13 months or something. Prosecuted in Rhode Island state courts. The prosecutor resigned and became a federal prosecutor where he could get real sentences. But the other factor was, in the federal system, if you you know, you can be a predator against adult women, many dozens, hundreds of adult women, and you are going to get 7, 8 years. You touch one kid, you're going away for essentially the rest of your life in the federal system. And that is a function of the random implication of the child pornography laws. I don't think it is a deliberate kind of anti-feminist thing. It is a creature of these very peculiar child porn laws that, you know, create this incentive to treat what are essentially extortion cases, sexual extortion cases, as child pornography cases, because all of a sudden you invoke these incredibly draconian sentencing regimes.
But this is the story. But this is the story too of like, but that exception, like children as this exception, is like a lot, is often the excuse. And Carissa, you can like correct me if on any of this, but like for challenging or walking back any type of like constitutional, like to putting in place like laws that challenge constitutional rights. So for example, like I feel like for most, you know, for all of like, for rating systems on movies or for FCC guidelines on cable, or what we watch on cable, or all of it is like in the name of protecting children. And similarly, kind of like all of like I do completely agree with you, Carissa, that there's like these Eighth Amendment, there's just a lot of carve outs, and exceptions for people who victimize children from like basic civil liberties, under this kind of normative like conclusion that like they're such predators and such terror, like it's a crime beyond all like kind of I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem, right, is the law statutes are just such imprecise tools, and given how we use statutes nowadays, they probably become even less precise. So, you know, legislators enact laws with the worst case scenario in mind, and then they draw certain lines, and sometimes those lines are arbitrary, and sometimes they were sort of drawn in good faith. They're usually drawn well outside of what conduct, you know, the legislature was actually trying to address. And, you know, if you read the legislative history of a lot of these laws, you'll see members of Congress saying that they're doing this on purpose in order to give leverage to law enforcement. I mean, I'm not trying to say, by the way, that sexual exploitation isn't a serious crime. I would say I think 7 or 8 years in prison is a long sentence. I think it's a long sentence. I mean, I get it that that's not where we are as a country, that 7 or 8 years, especially in the federal system, is no big deal, right? It's
Well,
not
hang
that
on.
high up on the sentencing guideline grid, but 7 or 8 years in prison, I think, is a
So
long sentence.
I agree that 7 or 8 years in prison is a long sentence as an abstract matter. But if you sexually assaulted or raped 50 or 60 people, you in real world, we would not be talking about 7 or 8 years. And the most prodigious of the sextortionists are racking up dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of victims. And they're, you know, they're creating they have figured out how to scale online sexual coercion in a way that is really quite prodigious. And I do think the disparity between the sentences that they are getting when all of the victims are adults versus when either in real world sexual, even, exposures, or when some of the victims, even a relatively small number of them, are underage, even marginally underage, is very hard to justify.
So I agree with you that that disparity is hard to justify, but I guess I'd also say, and I don't know, I'd have to look at the statutes that the people who exploit adult women are being charged under. It's not capturing the rapes, right? It's not capturing the abuse, it's capturing the exploitation. I mean,
some of these, I don't want to be too explicit on these, on this, but some of these
I mean
cases,
like the statute. I mean like the crime that they're getting charged for, right? Because so like, are you in Maryland or Virginia? Where
I'm in the District of Columbia.
You're in the District of Columbia. I'm gonna go with, well, that's hard because I don't know their criminal code, right? But Kate, where are you right now?
Massachusetts.
All right, so you're in Massachusetts. Some guy, I'm gonna stereotype because it's a pretty safe stereotype. Some guy rapes 15 women. The Massachusetts state code is not going to send that person to jail for 7 years, assuming no plea bargains, right? Assuming that he gets convicted of those sorts of crimes. I don't know the federal crime that you're talking about, but the hook is something other than the rape, right? I'm assuming.
Well,
after
so
the fight about VAWA and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's
So
exactly right. That's how federal.
It's really complicated, but basically, if the victim is a minor, the crime ends up being child pornography, right? If the victim is an adult, the crime can be ECPA, right, or CFAA. The crime can be extortion. The crime can be the federal online stalking statute, right? Or the crime can be some sort of conspiracy, right, to commit one of the above. And so you end up with these very peculiar charging mechanisms to get to situations that are deeply, deeply coercive and often very, very violent. And so I
appreciate that. I guess I'm asking, like, is one of the elements of any of those, I'm assuming not for extortion, and I'm not familiar with all the rest of them, but is an element of one of those crimes sexually assaulting somebody?
No, that's part of the problem, right?
I think that's Carissa's point, which is
I agree with Carissa's point that I think one of the answers here is to have a statute that actually addresses the conduct in question. But if you say to somebody, I'm just going to do this in a disgusting hypothetical that is not that hypothetical. I have images of you, and if you don't create a video for me of yourself doing something horribly degrading and violent to yourself, I will release this to your community. I am confident that violates extortion laws. It violates the CFAA if I procured that video of you or that image of you by hacking your computer or by some other means. But I do think that there's a real problem with the statutes that we're charging these things under, not addressing the coercive, violent nature of the conduct.
I mean, I totally hear what you're saying. And I guess I would just say the reason that the child pornography laws are so harsh is, if you read the legislative history of these laws, you will see that the people who enacted them say things like, well, these people are actually, hurting little kids. And maybe we can't catch them right now, but if they haven't already, they will soon. And so that's what we're putting them in jail for. We're putting them in jail because they either have or will abuse children. And so the sentences for possession of child pornography are not calibrated to the harm that people do by, possessing these images and seeking them out. It's calibrated to a harm that we're telling prosecutors that they don't have to prove. And that's, I think, in some ways, like, to drag us back very briefly to the Flynn case, like, people are angry about crimes like the false statement crime, right? Like 18 USC 1001, because people probably don't think it's actually worth 5 years in prison to lie to the FBI. But we know that people who lie to the FBI probably did other bad things. And so we want to create crimes that are easy for prosecutors to use to get an appropriate amount of punishment, even if they can't prove the things that we all know they really did. Now, this isn't a defense of Michael Flynn, but it's coming from somebody who's like no fan of 1001. I can understand where that anger is coming from, because it's kind of a shitty crime.
Yeah, it's also really interesting too. This is like why, but like everything you're saying is so human, but it's a really useful observation, which is, and I feel like it just needs to be said more, which is just like, as with all things, like life, things will go the path of least resistance and of like least friction, and this, like, all of the best laid plans, all of the most like intricate infrastructures and well-crafted statutes will completely fail if they just don't have, if there is something very difficult about it, which is like, there's a mens rea requirement that makes a kid prosecute, and no one wants to fucking do that to a kid. And so like, I just think that this is it's just a really great, thoughtful, broad point about the law. And like, I think you're brilliant for making it in this context, but I just also think that like, it kind of plays, helps that you make sense of, it makes sense of laws that like you think are political, or you think are kind of people like reflecting their own normative values or how they want the law to be or the outcome to be, but it's not always that way. Sometimes it's just kind of like, it's really hard to make the case procedurally with the limitations that we have. Yeah.
I just do want to say that Michael Flynn pled to it, and my capacity for sympathy for somebody pleading innocent without any changed factual circumstances to a crime that he pled to in order to evade charges on much more serious conduct is limited-ish. Sean Connor, you get the one question we're going to have time to take today.
Oh, excellent, guys. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Barely. Speak up.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I just had a question. Well, two questions, I guess, but one regarding Facebook. And it's my understanding that they only communicate with criminal or legal entities when someone is in imminent danger. In no other situation will they communicate or transfer any information to these other agencies. I didn't know if that was correct or inaccurate. I've also heard from some content moderators that there's often debates between the content moderators and their managers regarding certain users and their accounts. In one instance, I've been told that she was arguing with her manager over whether or not to ban a user who was transmitting child pornography. And he had pled guilty to earlier crimes, child pornography crimes, but the content manager wouldn't ban him because he was not convicted by a court of law, because I guess he pled out. I'm not sure exactly if that's an internal decision that they make or how that's handled. But anyway, just was going to get you guys' opinion on that. And 30 days since
I can speak to that pretty easily, and then Carissa, I'd like love your input. So so basically how this is, so child pornography is actually one of the quintessential examples of things that are taken down by algorithm in Facebook. Almost nothing else is. But the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, maintains a database of hashed images. Hashed images are basically like they take pixels from an image, they're unique to the image. It allows a computer to basically, in like a matter of microseconds, to screen an image before it's posted. And if you try to post a known image of child pornography that like is in the database and hashed on Facebook or any other site, they all use best practices, use this NCMEC database, and it's called PhotoDNA is the proprietary term. It's maintained by Microsoft. And basically they all use this to screen for child pornography. Of course, child pornography exists outside of the known universe of things that are like tagged and like are one-to-one matched. Like you might put up a picture of your kid in a bathtub naked, technically child pornography according to Facebook. And that stuff does fall under the purview of people like your friend who is a content moderator. And they might decide that that's child pornography and to take it down or something else. I would say there's a couple of things that kind of send red flags to me about your story and kind of what's going on. One is that there's basically little, like any serious child pornographer is unfortunately not using Facebook for very much. They just don't use it. It's a very well policed, pretty well run type of thing. Facebook reports any people that try to like upload things that are caught by PhotoDNA. Facebook and most other major sites report them to the authorities, which brings me to your other point about like Facebook only interacts with law enforcement agencies when someone is deemed to be in imminent danger. That's not true at all. There are a number of ways in which Facebook interacts with law enforcement agencies. They're subpoenaed by law enforcement agencies for data. There's frequently all kinds of like ways in which Facebook has to interact with law enforcement agencies. But Facebook will not proactively like reach out to law enforcement agencies unless it's mandated to do so by law. And which is basically kind of gets, I think, to your like reporting thing, which is basically like if they find something that's flagged by PhotoDNA that's definitely child pornography, they are going to flag it to federal authorities under the law. They have to. It's mandatory reporting. I think that kind of answers the question. I don't know, Carissa, does that seem, I don't know how much you've done with NCMEC or you've done with kind of the federal you've done a fair amount with the child pornography statutes federally, but what are their reporting requirements and things like that?
Oh my gosh, I have no idea. I feel like I just learned a whole bunch when you were talking right there. I mean, I would just say one thing about somebody who was charged with child pornography, but who wasn't convicted, and maybe there was a guilty plea, maybe there wasn't. This stuff gets really complicated. And once we decide to have a system where we don't have trials and we largely have guilty pleas, we're giving up accuracy for efficiency. So we're giving up truth in order to sort of keep the trains running. And we don't know, right? I mean, the same people who might plead, guilty to some other charge that's not child pornography might be doing it because they had an image of their kid in a bathtub and their lawyer told them plead out to something that's not child pornography because this jerk of a prosecutor is not doing anything. Or there was somebody who had like really terrible stuff, but maybe the state didn't have harsh enough child pornography laws to force them into a plea. And so they decided to just get them to plead to something, or maybe that's office policy with first-time offenders. We on the outside don't know the answers to these questions, and they're really, really difficult to try to find, even if you try, even if you look.
And this is the problem with per se rules. It's almost like it's like the paradigmatic example of like what is, they're over and under inclusive. Like they catch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just to return to the earlier subject, it's also the problem with Mike Flynn, right? So when Michael Flynn pleads out to a single 1001 count, from the outside, it is very difficult to know, is that because he is, that's what they had? but they had him dead to rights on that, and so you plead to that, right? Or is it because they had him on, 5 FARA counts and a kidnapping conspiracy, and by the way, they were going to lock up his son as well, and they gave him this out because they wanted his cooperation on things. And so you look at that 1001 plea, and what exactly it means is as opaque as somebody pleads out to a single count of something that's possession of something other than child pornography. You don't quite know what it means.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, it's like I just still, so Jack, I think we've mentioned him a few times in this episode, but like I find like Jack Weinstein is this judge in the EDNY, and I clerked in the EDNY and got to like occasionally observe him. And he has made it like his mission. It is not a very popular mission, but it is like a mission for basically talking about some of the draconian laws and like sentencing guidelines and everything else around like child abusers or people that have done child abuse or like have been accused of possessing child pornography. And like I said, does not make this man very popular. He's like, but there is, I kind of think that it's like a noble cause, because there are just so many things that we are wrong. Like, I don't think we're wrong on like how like these people abuse people, but like there does seem to be a really strong guttural reaction that I have, that I think all of us have. And there's something very visceral about, like, to me, almost as visceral as that reaction itself is like the idea that when something like that is guiding me as a principle of fairness, it's probably not the best like signpost. And like, maybe other people feel like it's the opposite, but at the very least, I think that like Judge Weinstein's work on this is just kind of like, it's fascinating and kind of, and important in like certain ways, even if it like trickles down to other types of offenders that aren't these ones.
So I having spent the time with these sextortion cases that I've spent, I have to say I have a lot of sympathy, which is not going to make me popular, but I have a lot of sympathy with the legislators who say, the people who are hoarding child pornography images are, if we can get them on that, we're going to avoid, more direct predations later. And I'm quite dismayed, Carissa, to hear you say that the factual premise of that may not be accurate, because I've been comforting myself with that for a long time, that there's it's a very crude sieve, but the people who are collecting these images, and I do think these sentences are outrageous, but the people who are collecting these images are actually creating a market for the abuse of kids. And I do think coming down like a ton of bricks on that is not the craziest thing in the world. That said, I'd feel even better about it if I thought you catch them for possession or receiving child pornography now, you'll save a kid 3 years from now.
I mean, you do. I would feel better about it too. But the thing is I will say is like, and this is something that I feel like has to be like kind of more of a focus, which is that like, we have these tools like photo DNA that allow us to catch and track these images. Like, if what people are really concerned about, and what a lot of people say when they are victims of child pornography or like non-consensual pornography, is the dissemination of those images forever on the internet, and that they live forever, and that the harm is continually like presenting itself because they're just paranoid every time they meet someone that they've seen these images. I think that we should maybe go straight for that harm and just try to take down, this is a person who loves free speech, but they should really try to like take down more of those images and focus on taking down the images. And like, you put the person away and that's like one thing, and then they live forever. Like, I feel like the focus should be there maybe, and like not about like necessarily like reporting. But anyways, we're way over time because Carissa was super interesting. And this was a great mystery guest. Thanks for being our mystery guest.
It was my pleasure. This was fantastic.
Yeah,
Well,
it was
thanks
really
for
fun to talk to
joining
you.
us. So we don't know who we have tomorrow, right, Kate?
No, but we should get someone special for our 60th episode.
60th episode on criminal justice issues. We will announce it tomorrow. In the meantime, Carissa, name a letter of the alphabet.
A letter of the alphabet?
Yeah.
D as in dog.
Okay, that means that David B has the wrap, the closing last words. David, what are your wise words for sending everybody off into the evening?
If he's there.
We got to unmute you. There you go. Hello?
I I have no wise words, but it was a
The
very
fortune cookie you once read.
Yeah, say something deep.
No pressure. No pressure.
The answer is 42.
There we go.
The answer is 42.
Well done.
We will be back tomorrow. And remember, until then, Kate?
If you can't have fun, come hang out with us in lieu of fun.
You got the order wrong, but okay, I'll take it. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.